Welcome to the Group Answers podcast. I'm your host, Brian Daniel. This is the weekly show designed specifically for pastors, disciple makers, group pastors, and small group leaders. Truly, we are created to help anyone with bottom line responsibilities for discipleship. Our goal is simple: to resource, train, and encourage you in the vital work of discipleship. This is the Group Answers podcast. Let's do it. All right, so Dr. Scott Hildreth, welcome to the Group Answers show.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate the invitation.
And you're coming to us at the time of this recording, as Brent Musburger used to say, we are live. Now, those of you listening out there, of course, that is not the case. But like you've already had, Scott has two hats at Southeastern Theological Seminary. One is Associate Professor of Missiology, and then the second hat is the Associate Dean of Ministry Preparation. And I was telling Scott before we started recording, I love academic terms, like professor, dean. I really like this idea of ministry preparation. So, Scott, thanks for taking time out of your day. I know you're getting busy or readying yourself for a couple of PhD seminars that are starting, what you said, the next week?
Yeah, I've got one that starts next week. Since it's Memorial Day week, we won't meet on Mondays. We've got Tuesday through Friday, and then the week after that, I've got a different seminar that's Monday through Friday that week. So, no rest for the weary. A
lot going on. You just wrapped up. You had graduation. I know you're in the grading period. I forgot about those days when I was in a not dissimilar role in one way, but very dissimilar in another way. So let me just ask you here.
Sure.
The book that we're talking about is in the short guide series that Robin and Allman B&H has, and your entry into that canon, if you will, is a short guide to evangelism and missions. So let me just ask you what's your story about how the Lord, and these are your words, awaken the missionary within you. And I really appreciate that. So talk to us about just how, what was the impetus behind this part of your life?
Yeah, I didn't become a Christian until I was 19 years old. I grew up in a Christian home, but it just never really made a difference. And then I became a Christian at 19. I was a freshman in college. And really, my testimony is a little bit odd for somebody who grew up in a Baptist church, in that I actually became a Christian through the witness of some Mormon missionaries. I didn't become a Mormon. I just knew from growing up in a Southern Baptist church, I didn't know much about anything except that, the Mormons were the bad guys. And so I needed to, when they came in and started talking about stuff, I needed to be real cautious. So I remember one day I was in a conversation with this Mormon missionary, and he just said, "Hey, what do you think it takes to be right with God? Or don't you think that God is, you're right with God because of the way that you live or follow his rules?" And the only Bible verse I knew was John 3:16. And so I just answered with some, great definitive statement as a kid who'd grown up in a Baptist church. No, the Bible's very clear. You get to heaven by believing in Jesus. And so the guy just basically said, and he pointed to my dorm room, which you can imagine what a dorm room would look like for a freshman who was away from home at a state university. And he said, "So you're telling me that you can live any way you want to live, and then say you believe in Jesus and you'll be okay?" And I said, "Well, that doesn't sound right, but I know that what you're saying isn't right. But I'm not sure I know the answer to your question." That one kind of question from that Mormon really set me on this journey of what does it take to be right with God, which then led me to read the Bible. And I had some friends who really walked with me through reading the Bible and understanding what it meant. But then having come out of, becoming a Christian kind of in college, I had a bunch of friends who weren't believers. And so really my first kind of introduction into the faith was explaining my new faith to my lost friends. So evangelism became part of who I was. God then led me into ministry through the local church. And so I was a youth minister. I was a pastor. And then one day I got a phone call. I was a pastor of a small church in Alabama. I got a phone call from a guy who was doing church planting stuff in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and basically just asked if I'd be willing to consider moving up there and being part of church planting. And Brian, I had, again, grown up in a Southern Baptist church, but by that time I had been to seminary and, Baptist college and had degrees. But I had never really thought about church planting. The only way I knew churches started was that people inside of a church got mad and they kind of split one out, and then you end up with two churches. And this guy started to explain that there were places in the United States that had limited access to the gospel. And that really blew my mind. I thought, this is unbelievable. We talked for a couple of hours, and my wife and I started praying through, what that meant. And then not long after that, I went on a couple of international trips. I remember being on an airplane flying back from a mission trip. And it was as if the Lord said, hey, your map is too small. You're just thinking about places in America where you need the gospel isn't accessible. There are countries and people groups around the world that just don't have access to the gospel. And that really kind of was an eye-opening experience where it was like, somebody's got to do something about this. And so God just used those kind of series of experiences to open our eyes to the needs of the world. And that became my real missionary calling. And from that point, man, we've just kind of never been the same. My wife and I have just always been people who are thinking about what it means to be on mission. From there, we went and served with the International Mission Board for 3 terms, came back here to work and to train students in missions and to work with churches about missions. So kind of the whole thing started with a Mormon missionary challenging my faith and then having to figure out, now, how do I communicate my faith to those around me?
I have another friend of mine that had a similar experience. So it sounds like a little bit that Isaiah 61, 1-3, this idea of the captives being set free, the restoring sight to the blind, beauty for ashes, which is also the scroll that Jesus opens up in Luke 4 and reads from that, awakened, when that experience up in the north with in Minnesota, it's like, what do you mean they don't have access to this message of the gospel that is restorative and is redemptive, and then I can yoke myself to righteousness, which leads to freedom, and they don't have access to that. It sounds like that's a little bit of that story, that awakened this part of you, then led you to conclude that something's got to be done.
Right. Absolutely.
It's like a here am I, send me moment.
Yeah, you get to this point. I want to talk about calling to my students and others. How do I know that God's called me to missions? And over the years, man, I've just come. The explanation that I've got is that God makes you aware of a need, and somewhere in your heart you say, "Hey, somebody's got to do something about that problem," and then you realize I'm somebody, and if God's put that on my heart, I need to do something about it, and that really becomes this impetus of now. And then God just kind of again, it just births that into you and makes it something that you can't shake and get rid of. And then it's kind of now what do I do with this sense of calling and need?
So the book, again, is the short guide to evangelism and missions. And Scott, I would ask you, what's your goal with this book? So you're 19 years old, and you've been on this journey that has culminated in essentially documenting your experiences here and passing it on. I mean, you are a teacher. That's one of your gifts. And so you've written this book. Is it more about philosophy, motivation, or like practicality?
Yeah, it's a really practical book. What I did was I took the Great Commission at the end of Matthew's Gospel, and the chapters in the book take apart the phrases of the Great Commission and just ask a question, and then that chapter answers the question. And so you're dealing with questions about, am I responsible for the whole world? Why me? And we talk about, no, it's Jesus has the authority to do this. Now, who am I there to reach? And we talk about people groups. We talk about the needs around the world. What am I supposed to do? And there we talk about evangelism. We talk about reaching your neighbors and reaching the nation. So it gets to some core missiology that we would teach, say, in a seminary classroom, but the real focus is to be practical, and it's for the average person in the pew who's asking the question, how can I be more obedient to the Lord or obedient to the Lord and be part of his mission? And the hope is that this book is a real practical help and a practical guide. Again, it's a short guide to evangelism and missions, so it's to take someone by the hand and in a real brief way walk them through this Great Commission charge that Jesus gives and give some answers. Okay, now what am I supposed to do about this? And it relates to how do we communicate the gospel? How do we know the needs? How do we know the needs of the nations? And so it really is hopefully a real practical help for people.
So evangelism and to a lesser extent, maybe missiology. I think missiology, because of its the dynamic of travel and people groups and things like that, that conversation seems to, I won't say flourish, but certainly hasn't fizzled. Evangelism, however, doesn't, what I hear when I'm talking with leaders is a tougher sell.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is this kind of content, the way that you've arranged it, would help with that. So if I'm a discipleship leader or someone with responsibilities associated with discipleship, which let's face it, is most of us, if not
Sure.
all of us out there that are listening, this would be a helpful tool for that.
Yeah, I think so. And the book is, yes, the book is designed to really challenge the reader. And the book is actually designed to be used in small group setting or an accountability group, or if you had a one-on-one relationship, somebody said, hey man, I want to know God's will, or is God leading me in this direction? Or how do I follow God in his missionary call, or being more evangelistic? The book is really designed to help with that. So there, we have a chapter that gives some practical helps. And then at the end, there are some questions for engagement. So how do I process what I've learned? Not the typical, hey, go back to page 1 and recite this, but rather, what, how do you make this? How does this make you feel? How do you apply this? And so there really is this application point as you work through the chapters there.
Scott, does it lend itself to a church-wide study?
I think it would, yeah. In fact, I could envision a pastor, say you take this book and it's part of your small group study, and then the pastor could preach, say, a sermon on the Great Commission, and then could take, say, the weeks that come after that, the next 4 or 5 weeks, and preach on these key components. He could take each phrase as it is in the book, but I don't think that's necessary. I think you could just preach on the Great Commission and then preach on the themes or the topics of each chapter, and then as people work through that in a small group, they could read it, they could work through the questions in a group together, and I think it would work really well like that.
Yeah, and I would add to that I think it would probably work really well as a staff enterprise as well.
Yeah, so we're always dealing as church leaders, as pastors, discipleship pastors, we're always dealing with people asking, how do I know God's will and what do I do with it? And the real hope of this book is that it helps with the answer to that question as we guide people through. So if you're kind of prepared with some responses, it can help with that.
I want to ask you this, as someone that's steeped in this conversation, this evangelism missional conversation, and as someone that's a member of the academy, and anyone that's a member of the academy is going to be also astute in cultural comings and goings. So I want to ask you this question, and it's kind of rooted in this statistic that I just saw, that 70% of pastors, obviously 7 out of 10, which is a high number, say that comfort has become an idol in their church. Comfort. So I want to ask you this: in what ways is this a new wrinkle in the conversation? How is this? Is it new?
Whether it's new, I think it's probably intensified. What that's
I guess the better way to put it is, in what ways has this conversational thread in our world changed?
Yeah, I think there are a couple ways. One is that people are more open to admitting that they make decisions for their life, even significant decisions for their life, based on whether it creates tension or anxiety or stress for them. And so then we know people are intentionally avoiding stressful and difficult situations. And then it's being characterized as the healthy, right, even spiritual decision. So now it's spiritual to pursue something that's less stressful, or causes less anxiety, or creates discomfort in our lives. And we also are seeing people make life decisions where our comfort and ease becomes a determinative value for making that decision. So on the one hand, we could say, well, then that looks good, because we have people who are making decisions, say, to earn less money in order to have a better lifestyle, or to have a different, say I want to live in a different community, or live in a certain way, even though it sacrifices some things maybe previous generations would have valued, job promotion, or name recognition. Someone's like, no, I would rather have a different lifestyle. And so that's prioritizing comfort or ease or something else. So on the one hand, we think that could be laudable. On the other hand, and I think this is where it becomes a problem for those of us that are interested in evangelism and missions, is that evangelism and missions are by nature uncomfortable, right? It's uncomfortable to choose to sell what you have and to follow God's call to a country or a context that's different. It's uncomfortable to think about sharing the gospel with somebody who would disagree with you. And you also know that by sharing the gospel with people, you're potentially creating discomfort and anxiety in that person. So if you raise comfort to this almost idolatrous level, that is, it's the thing that determines your worth, your value, spiritual decisions, life decisions, it undermines the call of Jesus to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow him. So now is when we have this problem, when it becomes juxtaposed with the call of Jesus, that the priority of comfort and ease, again, it becomes what I think is an idolatry of comfort. And that's a real problem.
That reminds me a little bit. Larry Crabb wrote a book years ago called Shattered Dreams, and it was basically what I would call a treatment of Ruth. And in that, he makes distinctions between the sacred journey and the secular journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to get into the distinctions of each, but that is a really fascinating approach, and not something. Is that something that you work out in the book? This idea of comfort as an idol?
Not directly, but what I would try to do in the book is highlight why missions and evangelism are important. I think that if you take it on head on, you get more pushback, right? This is right, or something. So, almost like judo, what's the momentum that you can use to swing the conversation? And so in the book, what I really am trying to do is to show, as a Christian, this is what God's called us to do. As a Christian, this is the priority of Jesus. And therefore, to be obedient Christians, we need to follow this. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but we don't do it under our own authority. We do it under the authority of Jesus. Now, I do make a big deal in the book about Jesus's promise to never leave or forsake us. When he says in the Great Commission, I'll be with you always to the end of the age, to try to show that even as we approach discomfort, anxiety, stressful moments, we don't approach it alone. And hopefully the presence of Jesus with us would make all the difference. And so that really is kind of this change of priority is what we try to get, less head on, but more in the sum total of what the promise of the Great Commission contains.
Let me see if I've got this right, because it's a really interesting dynamic that you're laying out. That as I make decisions for comfort in my own life, and that may be like simplifying my life,
Sure.
which is, I think a lot of us would agree, is a worthwhile enterprise.
Sure.
That you unload things that you don't need. But in doing that, like I've got a friend that was offered promotion, and he said, no, I don't really want that. He didn't want people reporting to him. I remember thinking about that kind of in the same way. It's like, on the one hand, you know who you are. On the other hand, it seems like you're kind of backing down from a challenge. And I'm not being judgmental, but that's kind of what we're saying, that in some capacity, you're not exercising those muscles that you're being called into to maybe grow in a certain way. And if that becomes like normative, and you apply that to something that's uncomfortable, like evangelism, and stepping into uncomfortable situations, possibly getting questions that you're unable to answer and really haven't been trained to answer, we just don't do it. Mm-hmm. That's the dynamic that we're talking about.
Yes, so, that and the extension of that is, if I have a value of comfort, then I know the other person has a value of comfort. And we also understand that evangelism, missions, has the potential of creating discomfort on the person I'm talking to. So it's like, I don't want to do that either. So it kind of competes against itself on both sides, and really squashes us into silence.
A double effect.
Yeah.
All right. So if we throw contentment into this, how would you define the differences between comfort and contentment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is best defined at the end of the book of Philippians, right? When Paul talks about having learned to be content in all situations, his contentment there is rooted in the will and the purpose of God for his life. If you read the book of Philippians, it's very clear Paul is not in a comfortable situation. He's in prison, chained between guards. He begins the whole book of Philippians by saying, that to live as Christ and to die as gain. I'm not sure which is the best. So he's in this real uncomfortable situation, yet he's also saying, but I've learned to be content. And as Christians, that is a spiritual discipline, contentment. But we're content by knowing that whatever comes our way is in the hands of a good God who holds us up and who cares for us and who meets us at this point of need. All of these promises in the Bible about when the Bible says God promises to be with us, all those come when he says, now don't be afraid, don't be anxious. So we don't make the decisions in our life to avoid discomfort or to avoid anxiety or to avoid stress, but we make them knowing that even as we approach anxiety, discomfort, and distress, that God is with us and therefore we can be content. So I think those are very different, like they're almost different sides of the same coin. And the thing that's in the middle is the will of God and the presence of God. And who is God in this moment? Is it me, so I can determine the outcome? Or is it the Lord himself, so that I can say, I'm going to follow him? And even when it's uncomfortable, I'm content because he's with me and he sustains me.
Yeah, I think in this dynamic, it's important to just be mindful of there are times in the disciples' journey that you're going to have to be okay with remaining in the tension.
Yeah.
And not abdicating the tension. I think sometimes we just want it to stop.
That's right.
Well, you turn on the TV, you order the pizza, you go to bed, and various of other things, a lot of other things that allow us just to a quick exit.
Right.
But you have to be willing to embrace that tension and understand and somehow find comfort in that. Well, let me ask you this. So as leaders and as disciple makers, I mean, what do you have to say about, like, to everyone that may be listening, about leadership in this tension? I mean, how that's, to say that it's not easy is not fair. There's a lot of things that aren't easy, but it can be tricky, right?
Sure. Yeah. I think the thing about leadership is that when we're leading people, we know the way and we show the way. We don't stand behind people and just push them where we think they should go. And in a situation like this, leadership is explaining, teaching, passionately compelling, exhorting people toward the perfect and good will and plan of God. And then reminding people that God is with them, that we walk with them as leaders, rather than just pushing down that path. And I think that's so as the leader, the pastor, the teacher in the church, I'm casting that vision from a biblical perspective. This is the will of God. This is what God's doing. This is what God has promised. Come go with me. And this is where your real joy and happiness can be found, not over here in this lesser than moment. At the same time, we as leaders have to go the way, right? We're the ones who have to be there and to say, I've been there, I've seen it, I've walked it out, and not to live the kind of life that doesn't also demonstrate our willingness to walk into uncomfortable, difficult situations. Again, I think it's the call of discipleship, right? We talk about a discipleship pastor and the discipleship journey. It really is. Jesus said, if you want to, you come after me, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me. That's the pathway of discipleship. We have to walk that too.
It's the discipline part of discipleship.
That's
right. Just to put it plainly.
That's right.
So, all right. What counsel do you have on developing a heart that's more sensitive to these issues? A lot of times missionality becomes the trip.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's a big part of it because there's money, it's a relatively high dollar.
Yep.
There's a lot of logistics.
Yep.
So there's a lot of energy that goes into that aspect of it, and travel. But how do we nurture the other side of this, the heart that's sensitive to evangelical and missional needs and lostness?
Yeah, I think first of all, it comes through spending time in your Bible and taking seriously what the Bible teaches us about what it means to be lost and what Jesus did on the cross when he saved us. Sometimes many of us who are in ministry have been Christians for so long that we have forgotten what it's like to be lost And we read the Bible and we see descriptions of hopelessness, helplessness, wandering in darkness, spiritually dead. And we know that they're true, but we almost read them as, these abstract principles without really appreciating the weight of that kind of life. And then appreciating what Jesus did for us when he made us alive in him, that he brings us from the darkness into the light, when he takes our hopelessness and gives us hope. And so I think spending time in the Word and realizing the truthfulness of that begins to birth in our heart, again, a love and appreciation for the gospel and what Jesus did for us. I think second, it's taking advantage of spending time with unbelievers, mission trip, people in your community, and then getting to know lost people and really seeing the weight of how their lives are a struggle because they don't have Jesus. Even if it looks like, from an earthly perspective, everything is going great, right? You can still say, yeah, but where's the hope and where's the help and where's, where is it that they're absent from the peace of God in their life? So I think those two things really birth in us that ongoing passion for the lost, which then allows us to go on these mission trips and go on vacation and go to places like that with a different type of eye. I joke with people all the time that I am the worst tourist in the world. I go to some of the most dramatic places and temples and mosques, and people are oohing and awing over the architecture. But my years of, and doesn't make me better than anyone else, but my years of being on mission and knowing people, sharing the gospel with people, having them question and reject the gospel means that when I go to a fancy temple or mosque or church building, I may be impressed with the architecture, but seeing past that to the lostness and the darkness it communicates is just something that resonates with us. And I think third, we ask God to give us a heart, his heart for the nations and his heart for the lost. And I think that's probably one prayer that God would very seriously answer if we prayed it regularly.
Scott, that reminds me of a conversation that I had with it was within our family about the what was the Disney Pixar movie about the emotions? But anyway, based on that, the question was, which one of these four emotions tends to guide you?
Hmm.
And my daughter was disappointed that one of her friends said that it was sadness. And I was thinking, is like, I think that might be mine. But I wouldn't call it sadness. I would call it lament.
Sure.
And I think you have to be careful with that, because I don't want to get the impression that I cry myself to sleep every night.
Right.
But I think there is an element of heartbreak implicit in our world that I think you need to feel. And you used the word a few minutes ago. You referred to just weight, and I think we should feel some weight there. All right, this is going to feel a little rhetorical. William Carey, a lot of us are familiar with William Carey, said we should not be contented with prayer. So talk about the role of prayer in this dynamic, this missional evangelistic dynamic, and what does William Carey mean by that?
Yeah, that's great. And it is an interesting quote, right? William Carey preached this sermon, kind of the initial sermon of the modern missionary movement. And he did say that we can't just be contented with praying. And the reason that he said that, right, William Carey was dealing in a moment in time where people were unwilling to proactively pursue evangelism and missions. It's the reason he titled his sermon An Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. In other words, we as Christians have an obligation to do something about lost people. And so he concludes the sermon by saying, we can't be just contented to pray and just hope that God somehow miraculously does something without our involvement and our engagement. And that's true. At the same time, William Carey was very clear, right? When he was talking with Andrew Fuller, as he was volunteering to go be a missionary in India, he told Andrew Fuller, I'm willing to go down into the pit if you'll hold the rope. So he's telling Andrew Fuller, I need you to pray for me and to get people to pray for me while I'm going on mission. So there's this tension, right, that even in Carey's life that we see, and I think we see it in our own lives. On the one hand, we shouldn't just be content to sit in our private closet in our comfortable homes and just pray, God, go bless the missionaries, help them have a good day, and that's all I want to do. That kind of prayer, it would be what Carey would say, don't be contented with just praying. At the other time, praying is a necessary component for missions. We even see the life of the Apostle Paul, the end of 2 Thessalonians, where he tells the Thessalonian Christians to pray for him, that his ministry would be a success, that he would be protected from unbelievers. So there's this tension of praying as a partnership in the ministry, or using prayer as an excuse to not do anything in ministry. I think that's where the tension is going to come, and we need to be really careful how we use prayer in that moment.
That's a good word, Scott. And that is going to wrap it up for this edition of the Group Answers podcast. Again, thanks to Dr. Scott Hildreth for taking time out of your day today. Group Answers is a production of the Lifeway Podcast Network. Executive producer Angie Elkins, edited by Colin Cruz, and engineered by Donnie Gordon. Produced by Nikki Ogden. And I'm your host, Brian Daniel. Group Answers is recorded at the Lifeway Podcast Studios in Brentwood, Tennessee, and in my personal studio in Evergreen, Colorado, with the help of Riverside.fm. On behalf of the Group Answers team, thank you for listening, and we'll meet you right back here next week with another episode of Group Answers.